So, hello again. I'm Tzvi Walter. I'm talking about Title IX. Title IX is, broadly speaking, a piece of federal legislation governing sexual harassment, sex discrimination, and even sexual assault in public schools, or really any school that gets federal funds. I'll specify that in a little bit as I talk about the history. In a nutshell, the history goes, the Federal Civil Rights Act of 1964 covered jobs, covered discrimination in work, and it covered discrimination in, quote, public places of accommodation, end quote, but specifically not in schools, or rather, specifically didn't cover discrimination based on sex against school employees. So in 1965, the Higher Education Act of 1965 covered discrimination on the basis of sex in schools. Title IX also actually refers to an amendment of the Vocational Education Act of 1963 and the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965. So while it started as part of follow-on legislation, sorry, it's a bit late, legislation governing discrimination on the basis of other characteristics, it was then added, or rather, discrimination on the basis of sex, specifically in schools, came later. Title VI, the amendment, Title VI, which I believe was in 1966 as well, covered, prohibited discrimination in publicly funded institutions, but only on the base of race, and I believe religion as well, but specifically not on the basis of sex. So Title IX really, what's the word I'm looking for, really fixes, that's definitely not the word, amends, updates, whatever. It changes federal anti-discrimination education policy to cover sex specifically. Also, it's interesting to note that it not only changed the basis on which discrimination was prohibited, but it also actually changed the way federal financial assistance, financial aid was disseminated to students and institutions. It actually provided a vehicle to channel the money to students and institutions rather than financial institutions, banks giving financial assistance, tuition assistance, and loans. In 2002, it's also fun to note, Title IX was actually renamed in honor of Congresswoman Patsy Mink, who co-authored it along with Senator Birch Bayh, whose son Evan Bayh was governor of Indiana. In 2002, it was renamed after Congresswoman Mink, and the text of Title IX, it actually is a very short piece of legislation in terms of the length of the text, and very simply it reads, "No person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance." That is the entirety of the Title IX text. It is a common misconception that Title IX only covers discrimination in sports programs, but that is because an amendment by Congressman John Tower sought to actually exclude school athletic department activities from Title IX, but the Tower Amendment was voted down by the whole Congress, and the bill was passed without it, and so there's some lingering perception that it only refers to discrimination based on sex in school athletic departments, and that is not the case. A little bit of the history of Title IX. It was passed in 1972, but before Title IX, there was an executive order by LBJ banning discrimination based on sex in federal contracting, but not in schools. In 1969, University of Maryland, hello, that's one of my alma maters, a university professor named Bernice Sandler filed a number of sex discrimination complaints against University of Maryland, using hard data showing discrimination in terms of promotion of professors, and in hiring practices, sex discrimination in hiring practices carried out by the university. She won a number of complaints. A number of her complaints, and following that began working for national feminist organizations to help them with suits against other universities for doing the same kinds of things. And so her efforts led to the adoption in 1972 of Title IX. Another important historical development was that Supreme Court of the United States, ruled in Grove City College v. Bell in 1987 that, quote, Title IX applied only to those programs receiving direct federal aid. So in other words, so this case was initially reached by the Supreme Court when Grove City College disagreed with the Department of Education's assertion that it was required to comply with Title IX. Grove City College was not a federally funded institution. However, they did accept students who were receiving Basic Educational Opportunity Grants, which is another federal program that some of you may have discussed. And so through a Department of Ed program, and so the Department of Ed's stance was that because of some of the students there at Grove City College were receiving federal grants, the entire school was therefore receiving federal assistance, and Title IX applied to it. The Supreme Court disagreed. However, in 1988, Congress passed the Civil Rights Restoration Act, which purposely and specifically extended Title IX protections to all program at any institution otherwise covered by Title IX. So Title IX, as we know it today, is very much a function of the Civil Rights Restoration Act of 1988. One of the important discussions going on now around Title IX, specifically under current Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos, editorial facial expression there. One of the big conversations regards sexual assault and harassment at universities and schools that receive federal funding for anything else as covered by Restoration Act of 1988. Actually getting federal funding for any program extends Title IX protections to anyone at the school at all. I'm going to post some links in the comments of this video when I upload it to the Teach Now site, so that you can see some of the sources that I used. And there, I have here the Dear Colleague letter that President Obama used to extend Title IX protections to LGBTQ plus students at any educational institution. There's also an article here in the opinion section of the Chronicle of Higher Education by a professor at Columbia University who's the director of the school Center for Gender and Sexuality Law and its Sexuality and Gender Law Clinic, which criticizes the proposed rules under Secretary DeVos's updates to Title IX. And one of the big changes to the rules is that Secretary DeVos would allow cross-examination, for lack of a better term, by by the accused of the victims, and not only by the accused of the victims, but it would require schools to allow cross-examination by, for example, RAs, resident advisors, or student advisors acting on behalf of accusers to interrogate survivors. I'm sorry, of the accused to interrogate survivors. I apologize. It's worth, excuse me, it's worth noting that other Supreme Court decisions throughout the 80s and 90s specifically extended protections against sexual assault and harassment. Gebser v. Lago Vista Independent School District in 1998 is one. Davis v. Monroe County Board of Education in 99 is one. And those decisions held that school districts and employees and the writers of the guidelines for those districts and organizations will be held strictly liable and automatically responsible for sexual harassment against a student when someone in a position to take remedial action has knowledge that the harassment is occurring and exhibits deliberate indifference to correcting the situation. And so that really is very different from what from the rules that Secretary DeVos is proposing, because because it shifts the burden of proof, not so much the burden of proof, but it shifts the burden for determining what actually happened from the schools and universities to the parties themselves. And as you might imagine, a school district or university has a lot more resources to quote-unquote prosecute incidences of sexual harassment and assault than does a traumatized survivor of harassment and assault. So there's quite a lot of discussion going on now, and again, I'll post the link to the Chronicle of Higher Education article that I'm talking about, and as well as an article of talking about some of the changes she's proposing specifically. Among other things, colleges, the actual purview of the college would be shrunk to only things that happen on their campuses, not, for example, in off-campus student apartments, which, just to go back to the University of Maryland, at this point, most students actually live in off-campus apartments that are nevertheless administered by the university. So it actually does make a big difference. I'm looking at my time and I'm realizing that I've gone over 5 minutes. I'm now into about 13 minutes, so I'll just about call it a night. But I would like to discuss Title IX further, because as someone who worked in the field of sexual trauma, this actually is kind of personal to me because of that experience. So I look forward to your comments. I look forward to further discussion, and have a great night.